The woodsman's biggest fear wasn't bears or brutal winters, it was people. So when he opened his door to 6 strangers that December night, he thought he was making the worst mistake of his life. Turns out he was making the best one. But not for the reason you'd think. Medieval Europe was basically one giant forest. We're talking about lands where you could walk for days without seeing a clearing, trees stretched endlessly across what we now call Germany, Poland, France, and beyond. The woods weren't just scenery, they were everything. Food, shelter, fuel, medicine, and even the materials for tools came straight from those towering oaks and pines. But here's the thing about medieval forests. They weren't empty wilderness. People lived there, not in villages or towns, but scattered throughout the woods in small cabins, alone or in tiny groups. These were the woodsmen, and they knew secrets that could mean the difference between life and death. A skilled woodsman could spot which mushrooms wouldn't kill you and which bark could stop a fever. He knew where deer paths led to water and how to read weather patterns and the way leaves turned. Makes sense, right? When your nearest neighbor might be miles away, you better know what you're doing. Most woodsmen worked alone. Well, they had to. Medieval lords owned these forests, and valuable resources like timber, game, and medicinal plants needed protection. Someone had to watch for poachers, mark trees for cutting, and make sure nobody was stealing the good stuff. The job paid decently, but it came with serious isolation. Then there's the actual work itself. Cutting down a massive oak with nothing but an axe? Brutal. No chainsaws, no power tools, just you, your muscles, and a piece of sharpened metal. A single tree could take days to fell properly, and that's assuming you didn't want it to crush your cabin when it fell. The weird part is how quickly this forest world was disappearing. By the 1300s, only about 10% of Central Europe's original woodland remained. Think about that for a second. 90% of those endless forests, gone. Turned into farmland, burned for charcoal, or chopped down for building materials. Cities were growing fast, and they devoured wood like hungry monsters. Every house, every ship, every tool needed timber. Medieval people burned through forests at an incredible rate, especially once they figured out that clearing land for farming meant more food and more taxes for local lords. But the remaining forests became more valuable than ever. A good stand of timber was worth serious money. The woodsmen who guarded these shrinking wilderness areas found themselves protecting increasingly precious resources. Their skills became essential, their knowledge irreplaceable. Living alone in the woods wasn't just a job, it was a completely different way of existing. No daily contact with other people, no markets to buy supplies, no doctors when you got sick. You either learned to be completely self-sufficient or you didn't survive long enough to matter. These men understood something most medieval people had forgotten: how to live entirely off the land. And as Europe's forests shrank and winters grew harsher, that knowledge was about to become desperately important for people who never expected to need it. But even the most prepared woodsman couldn't predict what one particularly brutal winter would bring to his door. Winter in medieval times wasn't just cold. It was a death sentence waiting to happen. When snow started falling across Central and Northern Europe, families held their breath. Would they make it to spring? The odds weren't always in their favor. Hunger struck first. By December, most families had already eaten through their stored grain from harvest. Root vegetables rotted in cellars. Preserved meat ran low. People got creative, grinding acorns into flour or boiling leather scraps for whatever nutrition they could squeeze out. Makes sense why medieval folks were generally shorter than us, right? Then there's the cold itself. Medieval homes weren't exactly built for comfort. Stone walls leaked icy drafts through every crack. Wooden shutters did little against howling winds. Your only heat source? A central fire pit that filled the room with smoke while barely warming anything beyond arm's reach. Families literally slept in piles, sharing body heat like human furnaces. Privacy was a luxury nobody could afford when survival was on the line, but here's where things got really brutal: losing your shelter. House fires were surprisingly common. One spark from that essential fireplace could torch everything you owned in minutes. Storms regularly ripped roofs clean off. Landlords evicted families who couldn't pay rent even in the dead of winter. Well, medieval compassion had its limits. Widows faced the worst odds. Medieval society didn't exactly roll out the red carpet for single mothers. When a husband died, which happened frighteningly often from disease, accidents, or violence, his widow inherited his debts along with his responsibilities. She'd suddenly find herself responsible for children she couldn't feed in a house she couldn't heat, facing a winter that showed zero mercy. Some widows had family who'd take them in. Others relied on church charity, though that came with strings attached and wasn't always reliable. The desperate ones, they grabbed their children and headed for the forests. Now, this might sound crazy to us. Why would anyone choose to live rough in the woods during winter? But forests offered something villages couldn't: anonymity and resources. Sure, you'd freeze, but you might also find shelter in abandoned huts, fallen logs, or natural caves. Dead branches provided endless firewood. Small game lived year-round in the woods. And most importantly, nobody could evict you from a forest. The downside was obvious. Wild animals, bandits, and exposure killed plenty of desperate families who tried this approach. Wolves weren't just fairy tale monsters, they were real threats prowling through winter forests, looking for easy meals. Forest communities developed their own informal support networks. Woodsmen, hermits, and other forest dwellers sometimes helped each other survive harsh months. They'd share firewood, hunting tips, or warn about dangerous areas, but trusting strangers was always a gamble. Which brings us to one particular woodsman who'd soon face exactly this dilemma. His quiet winter routine was about to get complicated when he discovered something unexpected at the edge of his territory, something that would test every survival instinct he'd developed over years of forest living. Disease didn't knock politely on medieval doors. It barged in, uninvited, took what it wanted, and left families shattered in its wake. When plague, fever, or the sweating sickness struck a household, survival became a cruel lottery. Men often drew the shortest straw. The widow's husband had been healthy 1 week, burning with fever the next, and cold in the ground before the month ended. Medieval medicine? Well, let's just say bloodletting and prayer weren't exactly miracle cures. She watched helplessly as the man who chopped their firewood, fixed their roof, and brought home their food simply disappeared. Now she faced winter with 5 hungry mouths and empty hands. Her eldest boy was maybe 12, strong enough to swing an axe, but not skilled enough to fell trees safely. The youngest barely walked without stumbling. Between them, 3 more children who needed warmth, food, and shelter she couldn't provide. Medieval society had rules about widows. Sure, churches preached charity. Villages talked about helping neighbors, but talk doesn't fill empty bellies, and winter doesn't wait for good intentions. Some relatives might take 1 child, maybe 2 if they were feeling generous, but 5 kids? That was a burden most families couldn't shoulder, especially when their own survival hung by threads. She'd tried everything first, begged at her brother's door until he stopped answering, offered to work in exchange for shelter, but who needed extra hands when everyone was preparing for the lean months. The harvest was already divided, the livestock already counted. There simply wasn't room for 6 more people in a world where resources were measured in spoonfuls. Then there's the cruel mathematics of medieval charity. Help a widow with 1 child, and you're being Christian. Help a widow with 5, and you're risking your own family's future. People whispered that large families were God's punishment or reward, depending on how things turned out. When things went badly, well, maybe God had his reasons. So she did what desperate people have always done. She packed what little they owned into a cloth bundle, gathered her children close, and started walking toward the forest's edge. The woods were dangerous. Everyone knew that. Wild animals, bandits, and worse things lurked between the trees. But staying in the village meant watching her children starve slowly, politely, within sight of people who'd grown tired of their suffering. The woodsman spotted them just as the sun was setting. Picture this scene: a woman clutching a baby, 4 other children huddled around her like sheep, all of them shivering in clothes too thin for the season. They weren't quite brave enough to enter the forest, but they had nowhere else to retreat. Makes sense, right? The edge of the wilderness represented both terror and possibility. Cross that line and you're beyond the reach of civilization's rules, but you're also beyond its protection. What happened next would determine whether 6 people lived to see spring or became another winter statistic. The woodsman had seconds to decide, and his choice would change everything. The woodsman's cabin wasn't exactly what you'd call spacious. We're talking about 1, maybe 2 rooms if he was lucky. Logs stacked on logs, gaps filled with mud, and whatever else kept the wind out. The whole place probably measured about the size of a modern bedroom. Now squeeze 6 people into that space for an entire winter. Privacy? That's a modern luxury these folks never heard of. Everyone slept in the same room, often sharing blankets and huddling together for warmth. The widow and her 5 children had to figure out how to exist in a space barely big enough for one person. Makes sense, right? Body heat was literally a survival strategy. Then there's the smoke situation. The cabin had a fireplace, but medieval ventilation wasn't exactly engineered to perfection. Wood smoke hung in the air like a permanent fog. Your eyes watered constantly, and everything smelled like a campfire. Windows were either tiny holes or covered with animal skins instead of glass. Glass was for rich people, not forest dwellers. But here's where it gets interesting. Everyone had to pull their weight immediately. The children couldn't just sit around complaining about the cramped quarters. The older kids went out to gather firewood, which meant trudging through snow to find dry branches. The younger ones helped inside, mending clothes or keeping the fire going. The widow put her skills to work right away, patching torn garments and sharing whatever knowledge she had about cooking with limited ingredients. Well, speaking of limited ingredients, hunger was basically the 7th member of their household. Winter forest food was scarce, and you couldn't exactly run to the market when supplies ran low. They were living off whatever the woodsman had stored up, plus anything they could hunt or forage. Dried meat, nuts stored from autumn, maybe some grain if they were fortunate. The weird part is how quickly people adapted to these conditions. Medieval folks were tough in ways we can barely comprehend today. Sleeping on hard floors, breathing smoky air, eating the same basic foods day after day. It was just life. No complaining, no expecting better conditions tomorrow. And the noise. 6 people in a tiny space meant constant sounds. Children talking, adults working, the fire crackling, wind howling outside. The widow's youngest probably cried from the cold and unfamiliar surroundings. The woodsman had to adjust to voices and footsteps after months of solitude. Let's not forget the bathroom situation, which wasn't really a situation at all. They had a chamber pot indoors for emergencies and a designated spot outside for everything else. Winter trips outside for basic needs were quick, cold, and miserable. Despite all these challenges, something remarkable was starting to happen in that cramped, smoky cabin. The daily struggle of simply staying alive was creating bonds between strangers. The widow was learning the woodsman's routines, while he was discovering what it felt like to have a family again. The children were adapting to forest life faster than anyone expected, but survival required more than just sharing space. It demanded mastering the delicate art of finding food in a frozen wilderness. Morning came with the woodsman checking his snares. Medieval forest dwellers couldn't just pop into a grocery store when hunger struck. Every protein source mattered. Rabbits were gold. Their meat fed the family, their fur lined boots, and even their bones made needles. But rabbits were clever. They knew winter meant survival too. The children learned fast. Within days, the oldest boy could spot rabbit tracks in fresh snow. The youngest girl discovered that squirrels buried nuts in patterns. Smart kids, these forest dwellers. They had to be. One missed opportunity could mean empty bellies for days. Then there's the water situation. Sounds simple, right? Just grab some from the stream. Well, medieval people knew something we sometimes forget. Not all water was safe to drink. The woodsman taught them to look for moving water, never stagnant pools. When streams froze solid, they melted snow in iron pots. But here's the weird part. They often preferred weak ale over water. Even children drank it. Why? Because the brewing process killed dangerous germs they couldn't see but somehow understood were there. Illness was the invisible enemy lurking in their cramped cabin. 6 people sharing one small space meant germs spread faster than gossip in a village square. The widow knew herbal remedies her mother had taught her. Willow bark for fever, pine needle tea for coughs. Medieval people were walking pharmacies, memorizing plant knowledge that could save lives. They had to be. The nearest trained physician might be days away, if one existed at all. Let's not forget the isolation factor. A serious snowstorm could trap them for weeks. No rescue teams, no emergency services, no cell phones to call for help. Just them, their supplies, and whatever they could figure out together. The woodsman always watched the sky. Certain cloud formations meant trouble coming. Animals behaved differently before big storms hit. He read nature like we read weather apps. Food storage became an obsession. Every scrap mattered. Meat got smoked or salted. Nuts were rationed carefully. Too many today meant starvation tomorrow. The children learned to ignore hunger pangs. Medieval stomachs were tougher than ours. They had to be. But here's what's fascinating. They found ways to make it work. The widow discovered the woodsman had been saving apple cores all autumn, letting them dry into chewy treats. He showed her how to make bone broth that lasted for days, getting every nutrient possible from their scarce meat. Each person brought skills that multiplied their collective survival chances. The forest provided, but only for those who understood its language. Deer trails led to water sources. Bird behavior indicated weather changes. Even tree bark became food when desperate times called for desperate measures. The woodsman knew which bark tasted least terrible and provided actual nutrition. Winter days were short, but survival tasks filled every daylight hour. No time for boredom when staying alive required constant attention. Yet somehow, in the midst of all this daily struggle, something unexpected was beginning to grow between these strangers. The cramped cabin that once felt suffocating began transforming into something warmer. Children who barely spoke when they arrived now filled the space with laughter, crafting elaborate games from whatever they could find. A pine cone became a knight's helmet. Twisted branches turned into swords for epic battles that lasted hours. The oldest boy taught the youngest how to whittle, while the girls created dolls from scraps of cloth and moss. Makes sense, right? When you're stuck together for months, you either drive each other crazy or become incredibly close. The widow brought something the woodsman never expected: stories. Long winter nights that used to drag on endlessly now flew by as she spun tales of brave knights, clever peasants who outwitted nobles, and magical creatures lurking in distant forests. Her voice filled corners of the cabin that had been silent for years. The woodsman found himself looking forward to these evening gatherings more than he cared to admit. But this wasn't just about entertainment. Medieval communities operated on a simple principle that kept people alive. Help your neighbor today, and they'll help you tomorrow. The woodsman knew this arrangement could save his life someday. When his axe broke or illness struck, having allies meant the difference between survival and disaster. Then, there's the practical matter of village connections. Living alone in the forest didn't mean complete isolation. Traders occasionally appeared, offering precious salt, flour, or metal tools in exchange for furs and carved wooden bowls. The widow's presence changed these interactions dramatically. She knew how to bargain, having dealt with merchants in her previous life. Her sharp tongue could negotiate better deals than the woodsman ever managed alone. Well, the children proved surprisingly useful during these trading sessions too. Merchants often felt more comfortable dealing with families rather than solitary woodsmen who sometimes had questionable reputations. A cabin full of children suggested stability and trustworthiness. And the weird part is how quickly they all adapted to each other's rhythms. The widow learned to read weather signs from smoke patterns and bird behavior. The woodsman discovered her talent for preserving meat with herbs he'd never considered using. Children who once feared the forest's sounds now recognized the difference between a harmless owl and a potentially dangerous wolf's howl. Trust developed through shared hardships that would have broken weaker bonds. When the youngest child fell seriously ill with fever, everyone worked together through sleepless nights, taking turns cooling her forehead and forcing herbal teas down her throat. When she recovered, the relief they all felt proved they'd become something more than temporary shelter mates. By late February, their teamwork flowed seamlessly. The widow mended clothes while the woodsman carved spoons. Children rotated through chores without being asked. Evening conversations included plans for spring planting and discussions about which trees needed cutting before next winter. The brutal season that threatened to destroy them individually was forging them into an unbreakable unit. But as the days slowly grew longer and ice began showing the first signs of weakness, bigger changes were coming that would test everything they built together. After months of surviving on dried meat and whatever nuts they'd stored, spring meant one thing: real food was finally coming back. Wild greens started poking through the snow first: dandelions, wild onions, and tender young fern shoots that tasted like heaven after a winter of bland survival meals. The children learned quickly which plants were safe to eat and which ones would make them sick. Well, most of them learned quickly, but fresh food wasn't the only thing demanding attention. Winter had been rough on their little cabin. The roof leaked in 3 places now, and one wall had a crack wide enough to stick your finger through. Everyone pitched in to gather materials for repairs. The woodsman showed the older children how to cut and shape new wooden shingles, while the widow taught them to mix mud and straw for patching walls. Makes sense, right? When your survival depends on keeping the weather out, everyone becomes a construction worker. Then, there's the fascinating way they learned from each other during these repair weeks. The widow had skills the woodsman never imagined. She could weave baskets so tight they held water, and she knew 17 different ways to preserve meat. The woodsman amazed her with his wood-carving abilities, creating spoons, bowls, and even small toys that made the children squeal with delight. These weren't just random hobbies. Each skill meant better living conditions and increased chances of surviving the next winter. Children being children, they pushed their boundaries as the weather warmed. They ventured deeper into the forest, learning the names of trees, tracking animal footprints, and discovering which berries would ripen first. The youngest boy could identify 12 different bird calls by early April. The oldest girl learned to spot deer trails and predict where rabbits would build their nests. These weren't games. This knowledge would feed them next winter. Let's not forget the planning that consumed their evenings. Sitting around the fire, they discussed what worked and what nearly killed them during the cold months. Too little firewood in February. Not enough protein in January. The sick week in March, when everyone caught the same cough. They mapped out improvements, where to dig a better root cellar, how much more meat they needed to smoke, which tools required replacing before autumn arrived. And the weird part is how naturally they'd started thinking as a unit. The widow no longer said, "my children," but "our children." The woodsman stopped referring to "my cabin" and started saying, "our home." Nobody made speeches about it or held meetings. It just happened, like spring follows winter. The children noticed this shift too. They started asking the woodsman to settle their arguments, and they brought their scraped knees to the widow for bandaging. Traditional family roles were blending into something entirely new, shaped by necessity and strengthened by shared hardship. But spring brought more than just repairs and fresh food. It brought visitors from the village, and with them, questions about this unusual household arrangement that would soon force everyone to make some very permanent decisions. By spring's end, something remarkable had happened in that tiny forest cabin. What started as a desperate plea for shelter had transformed into something medieval society desperately needed, a new kind of family unit. Medieval laws weren't as rigid as you might think when it came to survival. Local customs often trumped formal rules, especially in remote forest areas where official oversight was practically non-existent. Orphan children could be formally adopted into households, and widows had surprising flexibility in choosing new living arrangements. The key was community acceptance and practical necessity. The woodsman and widow had watched each other work through the harshest months. She'd proven her worth mending clothes, preparing meals, and managing the children with quiet efficiency. He'd shown patience, teaching forest skills, and sharing his limited resources without complaint. Trust had grown slowly, like ice melting drop by drop. Marriage in medieval times was often more about survival than romance, though affection certainly helped. Village priests rarely questioned unions that strengthened communities and provided for children. A woodsman with a wife and ready-made workforce? That made economic sense to everyone involved. But here's what's fascinating. The children became the real game changers. 5 extra pairs of hands meant the difference between barely surviving and actually thriving. The oldest boy could now set snares that caught dinner 3 nights out of 5. The girls had memorized which forest plants were edible and which would make you violently sick. Even the youngest could stack firewood properly and tend the fire safely. Winter preparations took on a completely different scale. Where one man might gather enough wood for basic survival, 6 people could stockpile enough for warmth and even comfort. The widow's knowledge of preserving food, combined with the children's ability to gather nuts, berries, and mushrooms, meant their food stores looked impressive compared to the previous year's meager supplies. Local villagers noticed the change during their occasional visits. What had been a struggling bachelor's cabin was now a bustling household that could trade surplus goods. Extra furs, carved wooden tools, preserved foods. Suddenly, this forest family had something to offer their neighbors instead of just scraping by. The transformation wasn't just practical, though. Long winter evenings filled with the widow's stories and the children's laughter had changed the entire atmosphere. The woodsman found himself looking forward to coming home instead of simply enduring another solitary night. Medieval society understood something we sometimes forget. Families weren't just about blood relations. They were economic units, support systems, and survival strategies all rolled into one. Adding members who contributed skills and labor strengthened everyone's chances. And the weird part is, this arrangement often worked better than traditional families of the time. Everyone had chosen to be there. Everyone understood their role in keeping the household alive. There was less room for laziness when survival depended on teamwork. What started as temporary shelter had become a permanent solution. But would this newly formed family face challenges that tested their bonds in ways winter never could?